Capital in the 21st Century is a book by French economist Thomas Piketty. It focuses on wealth and income inequality in Europe and the US since the 18th century. It was initially published in French in 2013, with an English translation released in April 2014. The central thesis is that when the rate of return on capital is greater than the rate of economic growth over the long term, the result is concentration of wealth, and this unequal distribution of wealth causes social and economic instability. Piketty proposes a global system of progressive wealth taxes to help reduce inequality and avoid the vast majority of wealth coming under the control of a tiny minority. The French version of the book has sold over 50,000 copies while the English version as of April 24, 2014 has sold approximately 80,000 printed copies and over 13,000 digital copies. Harvard University Press expects to sell an additional 200,000 copies. The book reached #1 on the New York Times best-selling hardcover non-fiction list in a list dated May 18, 2014. Contents: the central thesis of the book is that inequality is not an accident, but rather a feature of capitalism, and can only be reversed through state interventionism. The book thus argues that unless capitalism is reformed, the very democratic order will be threatened. Piketty bases his argument on a formula that relates the rate of return on capital to the rate of economic growth, where R includes profits, dividends, interest, rents and other income from capital, and G is measured in income or output. He argues that when the rate of growth is low, then wealth tends to accumulate more quickly from other than from labor, and tends to accumulate more among the top decile and centile, increasing inequality. Thus the fundamental force for divergence and greater wealth inequality can be summed up in the inequality R, G. He analyzes inheritance from the perspective of the same formula. The book argues that there was a trend towards higher inequality which was reversed between 1930 and 1975 due to some rather unique circumstances. The two world wars, the Great Depression and a debt-fueled recession destroyed much wealth, particularly that owned by the elite. These events prompted governments to undertake steps towards redistributing income, especially in the post-World War II period. The fast economic growth of that time reduced the importance of inherited wealth. The book argues that the world today is returning towards patrimonial capitalism, in which much of the economy is dominated by inherited wealth. Their power is increasing, creating an oligarchy. Piketty cites novels by Honoré copyright de Balzac, Jane Austen and Henry James to describe the rigid class structure based on accumulated capital that existed in England and France in the early 1800s. Piketty predicts a world of low economic growth, dismissing the idea that bursts of technological advances will bring the growth back to the levels of the 20th century, arguing that we should not base ourselves on the caprices of technology. Piketty proposes that a progressive annual global wealth tax of up to 2%, combined with a progressive income tax reaching as high as 80%, would reduce inequality. Reception. Support. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman called the book a magnificent, sweeping meditation on inequality, and the most important economics book of the year and maybe of the decade. He distinguishes the book from other bestsellers on economics as it constitutes serious, discourse-changing scholarship. Krugman also wrote, "At a time when the concentration of wealth and income in the hands of a few has resurfaced as a central political issue, Piketty does an unregistered trademark just offer invaluable documentation of what is happening, with unmatched historical depth. He also offers what amounts to a unified field theory of inequality, one that integrates economic growth, the distribution of income between capital and labor, and the distribution of wealth and income among individuals into a single frame. Capital in the 21st Century is an extremely important book on all fronts. Piketty has transformed our economic discourse. We unregistered trademark LL never talk about wealth and inequality the same way we used to." Stephen Perlstein called it a triumph of economic history over the theoretical, mathematical modeling that has come to dominate the economics profession in recent years, but also added, Piketty unregistered trademark's analysis of the past is more impressive than his predictions for the future are convincing. Branko Milanovic, a former senior economist at the World Bank, called the book a Euro-Eon of the watershed books in economic thinking. A Euro-British historian Andrew Hussey called the book epic and groundbreaking, and argues that it proves scientifically the Occupy movement was correct in its assertion that capitalism isn't working. According to Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Solow, Piketty has made a new and powerful contribution to an old topic: as long as the rate of return exceeds the rate of growth, the income and wealth of the rich will grow faster than the typical income from work. French historian and political scientist Emmanuel Todd called Capital in the 21st Century a masterpiece, and a seminal book on the economic and social evolution of the planet. The book has been described as a Euro political and theoretical bulldozer Euro in the French press. The Economist wrote, "A modern surge in inequality has new economists wondering, as Marx and Ricardo did, which forces may be stopping the fruits of capitalism from being more widely distributed." Capital in the 21st Century is an authoritative guide to the question. Will Hutton wrote, like Friedman, Piketty is a man for the times. For 1970s anxieties about inflation substitute today's concerns about the emergence of the plutocratic rich and their impact on economy and society. Piketty is in no doubt that the current level of rising wealth inequality, set to grow still further, now imperils the very future of capitalism. He has proved it. Clive Crook, while being strongly critical of the book, acknowledged that it's hard to think of another book on economics published in the past several decades that's been praised as lavishly. Criticism: Professors Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson used the economic histories of Sweden and South Africa to show that social inequality depends much more on institutional factors than Piketty's factors like the difference between rate of return and growth. Cross-country analysis also shows that the top 1%'s share of income does not depend on that difference. Professors write that general laws, which is how they characterize Piketty's postulations, are unhelpful as a guide to understand the past or predict the future, because they ignore the central role of political and economic institutions in shaping the evolution of technology and the distribution of resources in a society. One strand of critique faults Piketty for placing inequality at the center of analysis without any reflection on why it matters. According to Martin Wolf, he merely assumes that inequality matters, but never explains why, only demonstrates that it exists and how it worsens. As Clive Crook put it, aside from its other flaws, Capital in the 21st Century invites readers to believe not just that inequality is important but that nothing else matters. This book wants you to worry about low growth in the coming decades, not because that would mean a slower rise in living standards, but because it might worsen inequality. Lawrence Summers criticizes Piketty for underestimating the diminishing returns on capital, which Summers believes will offset the return on capital and hence set an upper limit to inequality. Summers challenges another one of Piketty's assumption, that returns to wealth are largely reinvested. A declining ratio of savings to wealth would also set upper limits on inequality in society. Of 400 wealthiest Americans in 1982, only 1 in 10 remained on the list on 2012, and an increasing share of wealthiest people have not increased their fortunes. Moreover, top 1% incomes are now mostly salaries, not capital incomes. Most other economists explain the rise of top 1% incomes by globalization and technological change. James K. Galbraith criticizes Piketty for using an empirical measure that is unrelated to productive physical capital and whose dollar value depends, in part, on the return on capital. Where does the rate of return come from? Piketty never says. Galbraith also says, despite its great ambitions, his book is not the accomplished work of high theory that its title, length, and reception suggest. German economist Stefan Homburger, criticizes Piketty for equating wealth with capital. Homburg argues that wealth does not only embrace capital goods in the sense of produced means of production, but also land and other natural resources. Homburg argues that observed increases in wealth-income ratios reflect rising land prices and not an accumulation of machinery. Marxist academic David Harvey, while praising the book for demolishing the widely held view that free market capitalism spreads the wealth around and that it is the great bulwark for the defense of individual liberties and freedoms, is largely critical of Piketty for, among other things, his mistaken definition of capital, which Harvey describes as a process, not a thing. A process of circulation in which money is used to make more money, often, but not exclusively, through the exploitation of labor power. Piketty defines capital as the stock of all assets held by private individuals, corporations and governments that can be traded in the market no matter whether these assets are being used or not. Harvey argues that Piketty's proposals as to the remedies for the inequalities are naive, if not utopian. And he has certainly not produced a working model for capital of the 21st century. For that we still need Marx or his modern-day equivalent. Harvey also takes Piketty to task for dismissing Marx's Das Kapital without ever having read it. Norwegian economist and journalist Maria Reinertsen compares the book to the 2014 book Counting on Marilyn Waring, New Advances in Feminist Economics by Ailsa McKay and Margun Jarnholt, arguing that while capital in the 21st century barely touches the boundaries of the discipline in its focus on the rich, Counting on Marilyn Waring challenges most limits of what economists should care about. Allegation of data errors. On May 23, 2014, Chris Giles, economics editor of the Financial Times, identified what he claims are unexplained errors in Piketty's data, in particular regarding wealth inequality increases since the 1970s. The Fort wrote in part, "The data underpinning Professor Piketty's unregistered trademark S 577-page tome, which has dominated bestseller lists in recent weeks, contain a series of errors that skew his findings. The Fort found mistakes and unexplained entries in his spreadsheets, similar to those which last year undermined the work on public debt and growth of Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff." The central theme of Professor Piketty's unregistered trademark S work is that wealth inequalities are heading back up to levels last seen before the First World War. The investigation undercuts this claim, indicating there is little evidence in Professor Piketty's unregistered trademark S original sources to bear out the thesis that an increasing share of total wealth is held by the richest few. Piketty wrote a response defending his findings and arguing that subsequent studies' March 2014 presentation, The Distribution of U.S. Wealth, Capital Income and Returns Since 1913, confirm his conclusions about increasing wealth inequality, and actually show a greater increase in inequality for the United States than he does in his book. In an interview with Agence France Presse, he accused the Financial Times of dishonest criticism, and say the paper is being ridiculous because all of its contemporaries recognize that the biggest fortunes have grown faster. The accusation received wide press coverage. Some sources said the Financial Times has overstated its case. For example, The Economist, a sister publication to the Financial Times, wrote, "Mr. Giles's analysis is impressive, and one certainly hopes that further work by Mr. Giles, Mr. Piketty or others will clarify whether mistakes have been made, how they came to be introduced and what their effects are." Based on the information Mr. Giles has provided so far, however, the analysis does not seem to support many of the allegations made by the FT, or the conclusion that the book's argument is wrong. Scott Winship, a sociologist at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research and critic of Piketty, claims the allegations are not significant for the fundamental question of whether Piketty's thesis is right or not. "It's hard to think Piketty did something unethical when he put it up there for people like me to delve into his figures and find something that looks sketchy. Piketty has been as good or better than anyone at both making all his data available and documenting what he does generally." In addition to Scott Winship, the economists Alan Reynolds, Justin Wolfers, James Hamilton, and Gabriel Zuckman claim that FT's assertions go too far. Paul Krugman noted that anyone imagining that the whole notion of rising wealth inequality has been refuted is almost surely going to be disappointed. Emanuel says, a colleague of Piketty and one of the economists cited by Giles to discredit him, stated that Piketty's choice and judgment were quite good, and that his own research supports Piketty's thesis. Piketty released a full point-by-point rebuttal on his website. Editions, French, Le Capital or XXIE Siècle, a Permil Editions du Seuil, Paris, 2013, ISBN 9782021082289, English, Capital in the 21st Century, Harvard University Press, 2014, ISBN 9780674430006. See also, Criticism of Capitalism, Gilded Age, Progress and Poverty, References. External links, the book's official website, text from Introduction to Capital in the 21st Century, all the raw data from the book, Newsnight's explainer about capital on BBC Newsnight, YouTube video of Thomas Piketty describing capital in the 21st century, a handy summary of the book with 6 charts by John Cassidy.